Imagine pouring your heart, savings, and sweat into reviving something forgotten, an abandoned lake, overgrown and left to rot for decades. You clear the weeds, rebuild the shoreline, and finally watch sunlight dance across the water like it was meant to be. For a moment, it feels like a dream restored. But just as the community begins to notice, the HOA shows up not with praise, not with gratitude. Instead, they bring paperwork, threats, and a chilling claim. The lake isn't yours. It belongs to them. How far would you go to protect what you've built? For years, the lake sat silent, hidden behind overgrown brush and collapsing fences. It was more of a swamp than a place of beauty. Locals passed it on their way to work, barely sparing a glance at the stagnant water and tangled reeds. To most, it was just an eyesore. But to Daniel, a mid-40s father of two who had recently moved into the neighborhood, it was something else entirely. Daniel wasn't a developer, nor was he wealthy. He was a man who loved projects, the kind of person who couldn't look at something broken without imagining what it could be if given a little care. When he and his wife bought their modest home nearby, they never expected to stumble upon that neglected lake at the edge of the community. Yet every time he passed it, Daniel saw not what it was, but what it could become. In the evenings after work, he would stand at the chain-link fence, staring at the water's murky surface. Most neighbors didn't even bother to slow down. They had written it off as wasted land. But Daniel envisioned picnics, fishing, and quiet mornings, watching the sunrise shimmer over a calm surface. It wasn't about profit, status, or control. It was about creating something beautiful. Eventually, Daniel dug into county records and was stunned to learn the truth. The lake wasn't technically abandoned, but it wasn't under any active management either. It had been purchased decades earlier as part of a larger development plan, but when the original investors folded, the land was left in limbo. The property taxes were minimal, and it had simply slipped through the cracks. Daniel realized that with enough determination, he could bring it back to life. The decision wasn't easy. His wife worried about the workload, about spending weekends clearing brush instead of relaxing. The kids didn't understand why their dad was so obsessed with a dirty pond. But Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this was his chance to do something lasting, something good not just for himself, but for the entire community. So he bought it, quietly. With careful savings, he acquired the parcel of land that included the lake and surrounding woods. No fanfare, no announcement. Just a man, a dream, and a daunting stretch of forgotten nature. The first months were brutal. He rented equipment, hauled away decades of junk that had been tossed there, and battled invasive plants that seemed to multiply the second he cut them down. Neighbors watched curiously, some offering polite nods, others muttering that he was wasting his time. But as weeks turned into months, the transformation became undeniable. The smell of rot faded. The water began to clear. Grass and wildflowers sprouted along the shoreline. By summer's end, Daniel had built a small dock with his own hands. The once desolate lake now reflected blue skies and drifting clouds. His children, once skeptical, now begged to go down to the water to skip stones and watch frogs leap from the reeds. Families walking dogs slowed their pace to admire the change. What had been forgotten was alive again. For Daniel, it was deeply personal. Every nail driven, every weed pulled, every board sanded smooth was proof that patience and hard work could bring something back from ruin. To him, the lake wasn't just property. It was a story of renewal, one that made him proud each time he looked across the water. Yet beneath the pride, there was a shadow. While Daniel worked, he occasionally noticed cars slowing at the edge of the lot. Strangers he didn't recognize, rolling down their windows to take pictures. At times, groups of neighbors whispered near the shoreline, their glances less admiring and more calculating. And once, he caught sight of a clipboard in someone's hand, a detail that lodged itself in his mind long after they had left. Still, Daniel brushed it aside. He believed that when people saw the results, they'd celebrate with him. After all, who could complain about a dying lake being restored? Who would object to a space that everyone could enjoy again? But Daniel hadn't yet met the one force that could twist even the simplest act of goodwill into a battlefield: the Homeowners Association. At first, the HOA remained silent. They hadn't so much as sent a letter while Daniel spent countless hours restoring the land. But their quiet wasn't approval. It was observation. They were waiting, watching, and preparing. And while Daniel basked in the satisfaction of what he had built, he had no idea that the very people who lived closest to him would soon be the ones to challenge his claim to the lake. What began as a dream project was about to turn into a fight for ownership, authority, and principle. Because in the eyes of the HOA, Daniel's lake wasn't his at all. It was theirs. The first letter came in a plain white envelope. Daniel found it in his mailbox one Thursday afternoon. tucked between a stack of junk flyers and a utility bill. At first glance, it looked harmless enough, printed with the HOA's familiar logo and official-sounding header. But as he unfolded the crisp paper, a wave of unease washed over him. The letter stated that Daniel's recent activities concerning the body of water within the community boundaries were unauthorized. According to the HOA, the lake was common property, and any modifications required prior approval. The final line was the sharpest blow: cease all work immediately or be subject to fines and potential legal action. Daniel stared at the words, stunned. He had checked the records, purchased the land, and paid the taxes. The lake wasn't common property, it was his. Yet here was the HOA, boldly declaring otherwise. He thought it had to be a mistake, so he wrote back, calmly explaining his purchase and attaching a copy of the deed. A week passed. No response. Another letter arrived, this one thicker, more aggressive. It listed alleged violations: unauthorized landscaping, construction of an unapproved structure, the dock, and failure to obtain architectural review committee approval. Each violation carried a proposed fine. Total, $3,500. Daniel's hands shook as he read. Not only were they ignoring his ownership, but they were piling on charges as if he were a criminal in his own community. Neighbors began whispering. Some sympathized, stopping by to say they admired his work. Others avoided eye contact, wary of being caught in the crossfire. A few, though, seemed energized by the conflict, the kind who thrived on rules and control. They repeated the HOA's claims, insisting that the lake had always been community property, and Daniel was trying to take it away. The tension spread like ripples on the water. The HOA escalated their campaign. Daniel received a notice taped to his front door demanding the immediate removal of his dock. A week later, a uniformed security officer contracted by the HOA showed up, photographing his property and the shoreline. His children watched from the window, frightened and confused. Daniel tried reason. He attended the next HOA meeting, armed with documents showing the county's records and his purchase paperwork. He explained that the land had been neglected for decades, that no one had touched it until he came along. He expected at least a civil discussion. Instead, he was ambushed. The board members, seated behind a long folding table, peppered him with accusations. They claimed his deed was invalid, that the county had misfiled the property, that the HOA had historical rights. When he tried to counter, they cut him off, raising their voices so that attendees couldn't hear his points. By the end of the meeting, the president of the HOA declared, in front of the entire room, that legal proceedings will determine the rightful owner of the land. Daniel walked out, humiliated and angry. But worse, he felt something he hadn't before: fear. Because now, it wasn't just about letters and fines. The HOA was preparing for war. In the weeks that followed, the harassment intensified. Daniel received multiple courtesy violations for unrelated issues: his trash cans left out too long, his lawn improperly edged, even a citation for a basketball hoop his kids had set up in the driveway. Each violation carried threats of additional fines. It was clear they were trying to break him down piece by piece. One night, he came home to find a bright orange notice staked in his yard. It announced that the HOA would be holding a community forum to discuss the misuse of common property. His name wasn't printed, but everyone knew who it was about. The forum was brutal. Residents who had once thanked him for restoring the lake now questioned his intentions. Some accused him of trying to privatize a resource that should belong to everyone. Others demanded access to the shoreline, treating his land like a public park. When Daniel reminded them that he had legally purchased and restored the property, the board countered with vague claims of pending litigation that cast doubt on his ownership. The lake, his lake, had become the community's battleground. Daniel's family felt the strain. His wife dreaded checking the mailbox, fearing another notice. His kids no longer wanted to play by the water, worried that the lake police might show up again. Even Daniel, once so full of pride, began to feel the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him. But surrender wasn't in his nature. If the HOA wanted a fight, he would give them one. He hired an attorney, a quiet but sharp man who specialized in property disputes. Together, they dug deeper into the history of the land. They uncovered decades-old plats, court filings from the failed development, and tax receipts that confirmed Daniel's rights. The case was solid, airtight, his attorney said, yet the HOA wasn't deterred. They doubled down, issuing threats of liens against Daniel's home if he didn't pay the mounting fines. They sent letters suggesting that his dock would be forcibly removed for safety reasons. They even hinted that his actions might be reported to the county environmental board. Every step Daniel took forward, hard. The HOA met with another obstacle. Then came the breaking point. One Saturday morning, Daniel arrived at the lake to find a crew of men unloading equipment from a truck. They wore neon vests and carried chainsaws. The HOA had contracted them to clean up the area without notifying him. The men claimed they were there to remove unsafe vegetation and hazardous structures. Translation, they were about to tear down his work. Daniel's pulse thundered. He rushed to block them, waving his deed and threatening to call the sheriff. The workers hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, until one finally muttered that they were just following orders. In the end, the crew packed up and left, but not before warning him that the board won't be happy. That night, Daniel sat on the dock, staring out across the water he had fought so hard to restore. The moonlight shimmered on the surface, beautiful yet fragile. He realized that this battle was no longer about a lake. It was about control, about principle, about standing up against a system that thrived on intimidation. But the HOA wasn't finished, not by a long shot. At the next monthly meeting, the board announced they had filed a lawsuit against Daniel, claiming exclusive community rights to the lake. The room erupted. Some residents cheered, others gasped. Daniel sat silently, his fists clenched. The fight had left the realm of warnings and fines. Now it was heading into the courtroom, and in that moment, Daniel knew. The real war had only just begun. The courthouse smelled faintly of polished wood and tension. Rows of folding chairs creaked as neighbors packed the gallery, eager for spectacle. Some came to see justice, others came for gossip, and a few, the loudest voices in the HOA, came certain they were about to watch Daniel crumble. For months, the board had framed him as a rogue homeowner, a man trying to seize community property for selfish gain. They brought in binders of paperwork, glossy photographs of the lake, and a hired attorney with a reputation for being ruthless in property disputes. To them, this was already a victory parade. Daniel sat at the defense table, his deed carefully tucked inside a worn leather folder. His hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of it all. He had fought too long, invested too much to falter now. At his side, his attorney whispered reminders. Stay calm, trust the documents, let the facts do the work. The HOA's lawyer opened with force. He painted Daniel as reckless, a man who, without permission, altered a shared body of water, built unsafe structures, and threatened the harmony of the neighborhood. Every word dripped with polished disdain. He gestured toward the board members sitting smugly behind him, as if they were the guardians of order against a dangerous intruder. The crowd shifted, murmuring. To many, it sounded convincing. Then it was Daniel's turn. His attorney rose, unhurried, and laid out the story not with flourish, but with cold, undeniable fact. He presented the tax records, proving Daniel had been paying on the property since purchase. He showed county plats, detailing the lake parcel as entirely separate from HOA-controlled common areas. And then, with deliberate care, he handed the judge a stamped, certified deed, Daniel's deed. The courtroom fell into silence. The HOA's lawyer scrambled, objecting, claiming the deed was erroneous or misfiled. But the judge leaned forward, flipping through the documents. His brow furrowed, then lifted. Finally, he looked directly at the HOA's table and asked the question that sliced through the room like a blade. If this parcel is, as you claim, HOA property, why has the association failed to pay taxes on it for more than 30 years? The board members stiffened. Their lawyer stammered. The judge pressed again, sharper this time. Why did the county recognize this land as privately transferable if it was under association ownership? Why, in fact, does Mr. Daniel's deed bear the proper seal and registration while you have provided none? Every eye turned to the HOA table. The smugness evaporated. The board president's face flushed crimson, his mouth opening but producing nothing. Their carefully spun narrative unraveled in seconds. Daniel's attorney didn't let the silence linger. He pushed further, pointing out the harassment Daniel had endured, the fines, the bogus violations, the attempt to send contractors onto private property without notice. Each accusation was backed by letters, photos, timestamps. With every piece of evidence, the HOA shrank smaller and smaller in their seats. And then came the final blow. The attorney revealed correspondence obtained through discovery, internal emails between board members. In them, they openly admitted the lake had never been under their control. They acknowledged the tax lapse, even joked about it. One message read, "If we push hard enough, he might cave." Nobody wants the legal hassle. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, whispers, even a few angry shouts filled the air. The judge banged his gavel for silence, but the damage was done. The HOA hadn't just been wrong. They had knowingly lied, bullied, and tried to strip a man of what was rightfully his. Daniel sat, heart pounding, as the judge delivered his ruling. The lake was his, unequivocally. The deed stood, the ownership confirmed. The HOA's claims were baseless, their fines unenforceable. Not only that, but the judge reprimanded the association for harassment, ordering them to cease all interference with Daniel's property. In a rare twist, he even suggested that the board consider compensating Daniel for undue stress and legal costs. The HOA's table looked shattered. The once proud president slumped forward, sweat shining on his forehead. Their attorney shuffled papers without purpose, eyes fixed anywhere but the judge's gaze. The gallery buzzed with disbelief, neighbors exchanging wide-eyed looks. Some whispered apologies in Daniel's direction. Others avoided his eyes, ashamed at having believed the lies. For Daniel, the moment was overwhelming. Months of fear, humiliation, and relentless attacks collapsed into vindication. His fists unclenched, his shoulders finally eased. He glanced at his wife, who sat with tears streaming silently down her face, pride and relief mingling in her expression. But as sweet as victory tasted, there was a bitter edge. He knew the HOA wouldn't vanish overnight. Their power, their pettiness, it wouldn't simply dissolve because of one ruling. This was a turning point, yes, the climax of their battle. But the war of living in this community, of sharing streets and sidewalks with those who had tried to ruin him, was far from over. Still, as he walked out of the courthouse that day, neighbors parting to let him pass, one truth burned brighter than everything else. They had tried to take what was his. They had tried to break him, and they had failed. The morning after the court ruling, Daniel sat on his dock with a cup of coffee, watching the lake mist curl like smoke across the water. For the first time in months, he felt at peace. No letters, no threats, no clipboard-wielding strangers creeping around his property. Just silence, broken only by the splash of a fish near the reeds. But peace didn't come instantly to the community. News of the judge's decision spread like wildfire. Some neighbors congratulated Daniel in hushed tones, almost embarrassed they hadn't supported him sooner. Others grumbled, still clinging to the HOA's narrative, though they had no evidence left to stand on. The board itself was in chaos. The president, once so commanding, faced demands for resignation. At the next meeting, turnout doubled, residents furious at how their dues had been wasted on a doomed lawsuit. Copies of the internal emails had circulated, revealing the truth. The board had known they couldn't win, but pressed forward anyway, gambling with other people's money. Voices rose, fingers pointed, and by the end of the night, the president stepped down in disgrace. Two more board members followed within weeks, unable to withstand the backlash. The HOA, once iron-fisted, suddenly seemed brittle, exposed, and leaderless. Daniel didn't gloat. He didn't need to. Their downfall spoke for itself. Instead, he focused on the lake. He patched up the damage from the attempted cleanup crew, replanted wildflowers along the shore, and even added benches for families who wanted to sit by the water. He posted a small sign at the entrance, not boastful, but clear. Private property, welcome by permission of the owner. It was a quiet declaration of both generosity and boundary. And neighbors came. Children who had once whispered about the lake police now returned with fishing poles and wide-eyed wonder. Families strolled the trail Daniel had carved, their dogs splashing at the edge. It wasn't a public park, nor was it an exclusive retreat. It was something in between, a place built with care, offered with kindness, but defended with strength. For Daniel's family, the change was transformative. His wife, once weighed down by stress, began to smile again. She joined him on evening walks, sometimes sitting beside him on the dock as the sun dipped below the horizon. Their children grew proud of what their father had done, bragging to friends that our dad saved the lake. Yet the HOA's shadow didn't vanish entirely. Small skirmishes continued, petty notices about unrelated violations, passive-aggressive remarks at community events. But these no longer carried weight. After the court case, everyone knew the board's power wasn't absolute. Daniel's victory had drawn a line in the sand, one that others quietly took note of. In time, the neighborhood changed. The board, weakened and watched closely, became less aggressive. Residents who had once feared retaliation began pushing back, questioning fines and demanding transparency. Meetings shifted tone, less dictatorial, more democratic. It wasn't perfect, but the atmosphere was lighter. And at the center of it all, the lake stood as both a symbol and a reminder. A symbol of what one person's determination could restore. A reminder of how quickly power could corrupt when left unchecked. But perhaps the most surprising impact came months later. Daniel received a letter, not from the HOA, but from the county. They had heard about the dispute and, impressed by his restoration work, wanted to partner with him on a conservation program. Grants, resources, and expert support were offered to help preserve the lake as a natural habitat. Daniel accepted carefully. He insisted that ownership remain his, that no bureaucratic tangle could ever strip it away again. The county agreed, and soon biologists and volunteers were helping him plant native species, build nesting areas for birds, and ensure the water stayed clean. What began as a personal project had grown into something larger, something enduring. Neighbors who once scoffed now praised. Children studied the wildlife for school projects. Families gathered for seasonal events by the shore. The lake, once abandoned, became the community's heartbeat, not because the HOA claimed it, but because Daniel had refused to let it be stolen. Still, the scars of the battle lingered. Daniel often thought back to the harassment, the sleepless nights, the fear of losing everything. He knew not everyone would have had the resources, the stubbornness, or the support to fight as he did. Many would have caved under the weight of endless fines, threats, and legal intimidation. That thought haunted him and hardened his resolve, because his story wasn't just about a lake. It was about power, about how fragile justice can be when ordinary people are bullied by organizations meant to protect them, about how easily truth can be twisted until a lie feels like fact, and about how sometimes the only way forward is to stand your ground, no matter the cost. In conversations with neighbors, Daniel began to share his story more openly, not angrily, not bitterly, but honestly. He encouraged them to read their governing documents, to question authority when it felt wrong, to remember that an HOA was supposed to serve the community, not rule it. Some listened politely, others nodded with new conviction. Slowly, a culture shifted. The lake had sparked more than beauty. It had sparked awareness. Years later, Daniel would look back on that battle as one of the hardest, most exhausting chapters of his life. Yet he would also remember it as one of the most defining, not because he beat the HOA, but because he protected something that mattered, something he had built with his own hands, guarded with his own courage, and passed on to his family and neighbors as a gift they never expected. And when people asked him why he didn't just give in, why he didn't let the HOA take control to avoid the headache, his answer was always the same. Because if they could take the lake, they could take anything. The lake, once forgotten, had become immortalized, not just in maps and deeds, but in memory, in principle, in the quiet ripples of water that reflected both struggle and triumph. So when the sun set each evening, casting gold across the dock Daniel built with his own hands, it wasn't just light dancing on the water. It was proof that sometimes, against all odds, the individual can stand taller than the system. And as for the HOA, their power never fully recovered. New board members came and went, each one reminded by whispers of the past. Don't push too far. Don't overreach. Don't forget what happened when you tried to claim what wasn't yours. Because in that neighborhood, there would always be one man, one lake, and one story that proved just how raw